It's now time, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome our very special guest speaker for tonight. He is Tim O'Connor. Tim is currently the Director at the Refugee Council of Australia. Over the last decade and a half, he has worked in the areas of human rights, international and development across the world, attempting to raise the voices of communities to bring about justice. The brutal manner in which Australia treats people who arrive here seeking asylum undermines, many believe, Australia's international reputation. It's also costing taxpayers billions of dollars and doing untold harm to many thousands of people on Manus Island, in Nauru and in Australia. As the world faces the greatest ever crisis of human displacement, Tim will outline tonight the option of a humane, lawful and sustainable approach to managing this crisis of responsibility that offers a productive resolution for millions of refugees on the international community. And I'm sure all of you would agree that Tim is a fantastic guest speaker tonight, aligning perfectly with the values of love, hope, compassion and justice. Please welcome Tim.
Thank you very much for having me this evening. Thank you very much to Mary Aikenhead. Welcome to me, I guess. I haven't been at the conference all day. I hope you've had a nice time. Thank you, Bishop Brady, as well. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As Natasha so eloquently explained, in that beautiful voice. How do you get that voice? I can't do it. It comes from many years' practice. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm standing in, of course, with Phil Glendenning, the President of the Refugee Council, who sends his very sincere apologies. Phil is having his first long service leave ever, taking a well-deserved couple of months break. And he's currently, he tells me, touring around Trump's America. And he's got his guitar in hand, so who knows where that may end. I should also acknowledge the fact we're on Indigenous land. And respect the elders past and present. It's not a very uplifting topic often, refugees and asylum seekers. It's a difficult one to perhaps have after dinner, and I'm going to make it even more difficult because I've got a few graphs. Excited? So, I guess, how did I come to the Refugee Council? My background, I studied economics. I grew up in country Victoria. I studied economics and law. I had dreams of living in a big house and having a big fast car, probably a red one with a mobile phone. They were about this big back then. And I worked in corporate law for a while, a couple of years, or 18 months or so. And I found it very dispiriting. I didn't know what I was going to do. One day I just didn't go into work, and my family was in hotels, and I was working in pubs for a while, and after a few months I realised that wasn't going to be a very long life if I continued to do that. So I signed up for a thing called Australian Volunteers Abroad, which is an amazing initiative that sends young university graduates off to see the world. And I was very fortunate. I'd never been outside Australia up until that point, but I was very fortunate to land a position with the Tibetan government in exile, based in the north of India, in a place called Dharamsala. And the Tibetan government in exile, of course, is where the Dalai Lama lives. This was all news to me. It was probably even before the internet, so I probably read it in a book. Remember those? And I arrived in Delhi. That's a pretty incredible introduction into the South Asia. I then got in a car, as I was instructed to do, and headed up to the place I was called, which is now, Dharamsala is quite famous now, of course, because it has a cricket pitch there. I think the final test against India was played there, but when I was there, it wasn't in existence at that time. It was a pretty small town, and I got there in the evening. Had been travelling all day. Kind of no one really was around. Couldn't work out what was going on. Someone eventually turned up and put me into the hotel for the evening. And then I slept for a long time, woke up in the morning, and there was no one really around. I was thinking, what have I come to here? This is very strange. And I realised that there was this sort of big palacey looking thing down the bottom of the hill. So I sort of could hear some murmurings there, and I traipsed down. In fact, it wasn't a palace, it was a temple, where the Dalai Lama, and I'd arrived in the middle of Losar, Tibetan New Year. And the Dalai Lama, during Losar, spends as much time as he requires to share the knowledge he has with his constituents, with his people. And I walked into the temple, and it was apparently 3 days into the sharing of knowledge. I found this out later. Someone gave me a little headset to pop into my ear, which translated as he went. And I realised that all the people lying prostrate on the ground weren't people like me. They were probably Tibetans. But then there was all these white people that looked more like me over in the corner. So I very sort of gingerly shuffled across the prostrate people, saying, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, stepping on people's hands and, feeling very embarrassed. And then, flushed-faced, I sat down, this is not one word of a lie, right between Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford, who were then an item, but not for long, obviously, after I turned up. And it was an incredible experience, and that was because as I was sitting there realising, that's Richard Gere, and, oh God, that's Cindy Crawford. I need to look straight ahead and not look so embarrassed. And then I was looking ahead, I was thinking, that's Martin Scorsese, because he was at the time making a film called Kundun about the Dalai Lama, the story of the Dalai Lama. And sitting with him was Melissa Matheson, who was at that time married to Harrison Ford, who was also there. Everyone was there. B from Prisoner was at this thing. Absolutely everyone. Upstairs from me at the place I got back to, the Beastie Boys were actually living above me. It was incredible. It was amazing to be sort of thrown into this world of, a population of refugees, and to be surrounded by these serious Hollywood A-list people, and B from Prisoner, of course. And I got to learn a lot about the Tibetans. My job was to establish the Tibetan Desk of Human Rights. At that time, not knowing very much about Tibet, I didn't really know much about the situation, but there was people coming across, following the Dalai Lama across, the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people. They would follow him out of India. He left there in the late 40s, arrived in the 50s. And India, being a signatory to the Refugee Convention, they welcomed the Tibetans into their country. And the Tibetans were able to work, their children were able to go to school, they got access to healthcare. Things were difficult for the Tibetans. They were very unlikely to be heading back to Tibet anytime soon, and it still looks unlikely. But at least they could live with some dignity there. And I had the opportunity, from there to meet other refugee communities who would come through and check out how the Tibetans were going. And I got interested in the situation of the people in the north of Thailand, mostly Burmese ethnic minority groups, who were themselves refugees, been forced out of their country, many of them Christian. And I worked in the camps up there for 18 months as a volunteer. And basically the camps were full of older people, some children and some women, and the men were often back fighting, a brutal war against the Burmese military. And when they got injured or when they required a bit of healing time, they would come back across. And Thailand wasn't a signatory to the Convention on Refugees. So the people who were living there, around 70,000 in the area I was in, Mae La, they had no access to work. They couldn't send their kids to school. They didn't have access to healthcare. And it was many Christian groups, in fact, the Thai-Burma Border Commission, who was supported by many Christian groups from around the world, including Caritas, who many of you will know, and Catholic Mission too, were providing this basic assistance to keep people alive. And it was a vastly different experience. Because people couldn't work, they were forced into all sorts of nefarious activities. The women would often be pushed into sex trafficking, or the men would be dealing drugs, or the young boys often. So the establishment of school and building some structured existence for people and trying to let them live with some dignity was the sort of work that I did there. After that, I came back to Australia and I worked with Caritas Australia. I then, where I was for a few years, and then have spent a couple of years working with UNICEF. And my job there was looking after the UNICEF's international programs, funded out of Australia, around $30 million funded from the generosity of the Australian people, and about $110 million at times from the Australian government. And primarily it was working in emergency situations, often with refugees and displaced people. And then I heard in 2014 that although the Refugee Council, which I'd never really had much knowledge of in the past, had been allocated a small amount of money, around $140,000 from government, that 2 weeks after the budget, the then Immigration Minister had made a big press conference and song and dance, some may say, of cutting that $140,000. And that was the only funding they were getting from government. The rest of it was coming from the public. And it looked like the Refugee Council might close. So I rang Paul up, who's the CEO, and said, we've really got to make a big noise about this. This is a terrible situation. This is the manner in which Australia is treating, not so much refugees, because we treat them quite well, but people seeking asylum really needs to be addressed, and we need a national voice. And so I spent a little bit of time kind of ramping that up in the media with Paul and some others at the council, including Phil, and got to know some of the people. And a couple of years later, I left my job at UNICEF and have joined the Refugee Council, where I've been for a year or so. And the work is vast and extensive, and we're a peak body. We have 180 member organisations, organisations from across the spectrum of settlement organisations, which is the good news story of Australia's treatment of refugees. Australia has what is regarded as the best refugee resettlement system in the world. Often when I'm speaking about my job to people I just meet, I say, oh God, that must be so horrible. But in fact, we worked very hard on getting the then Abbott government to commit to 12,000 Syrian and Iraqis being introduced to Australia. And we worked with Senator Sinodinos and even Mr Dutton back then to make that announcement come about. And when you get the opportunity to go and meet those children as they come off the plane, that's a pretty heartwarming experience, to take them to their house, to help them enrol in school, to take them to the doctor and get the vaccinations that they require, to help their parents get an opportunity to retrain and reskill. So that's a really incredibly heartening part of the role, and Australian government funds that particularly well. The other end, of course, is the asylum end, where many of our member organisations are also from, and that is incredibly difficult. And it really speaks to the duality, the kind of schizophrenia that exists in the policy at the moment. We've got this great news story that we can't really talk too much about, and then this situation of utter horror of people being in Nauru and Manus. And I think it's particularly of concern. I was talking to Tony about this before. It's particularly of concern to me the way we are managing the asylum situation, because it's incredibly unsustainable. It's doing untold damage to our international reputation. In one of my last meetings with UNICEF, we were running a program in Ethiopia with the Oromo people, and we finally, we'd been trying to get an audience with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia for a long time to try and get some political support from that project. And those not familiar with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, he's not a very nice guy. He has a long history of doing very nasty things to individuals, but to specific groups. Oromo, for instance, many refugees from Oromo in Australia. But as soon as I came in, he picked that I was Australian, and he was straight across the table at me going, "Don't you come here talking to me about how we treat our people. You as an Australian, how you treat your refugees. It's a disgrace to you." That's what he was saying. It was a real affront. So when these kind of pretty nasty people are calling us to account on that, I think that really does shine a light back on us. So I'm going to just jump into the graphs. I know you've been really waiting for this. Breathe out. Ready? But basically what I'm trying to do here is show you why our current policy is entirely unsustainable. The current situation... this is a bit of a nicer story. This Alex Seaton is an amazing artist. He's a 24-year-old. He was on Christmas Island. He was out there because they have these amazing crabs. And 38 life jackets washed up. And he went down and thought that was quite odd. It's actually not a very nice story. And he found in them Iranian currency was stuffed in some of the life jackets. These are people that never were on anyone's radar. And he spent over a year making these life jackets that he saw out of marble. It's an incredible exhibition called The Island. And this piece is people died to have a life like mine. It's an incredible exhibition, an incredible artist and a young man. I think also that's one of the it is a dire situation at the moment, but this current moment is creating lots of opportunities for people to speak out and to do interesting projects like art. Is it changing the political situation? No, it's not, but we've got to keep working at that because we really need to. There's 65 million. It's actually 65 million now. Some of these stats are a little bit out of date. Displaced people in the world. And I guess the worst thing about that, even if you can't read the numbers, is that it's going up. It's not getting any better. This is the worst it's been since 1945. A lot of people are now displaced. And the last few years you've seen massive increases in that number of displaced people. And why is that, of course? Because of Syria. Of those, it breaks down to, of that 65 million, so again, these numbers are a little bit out, but 21 million of those are recognised as refugees. 37 million of them are what we call, in our lovely, warm, bureaucratic language, they're called internally displaced people, so people who've been forced from their homes, basically. It's 37 million, and 3.2 million of them are asylum seekers. So they're out of their country, they're out of their home, they're out of their country, and they're trying to get refugee status. Because most people don't know the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee, but a refugee is someone who they've said, I'm being persecuted, and that the fear of persecution that they have has been recognised. So they're officially a refugee registered with the UNHCR or some of the other bodies that register them. Asylum seeker is someone who's claiming refugee status. They want to be a refugee. Where do they all come from? They come from Syria, particularly in the last few years. Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, Congo, all the countries that seem a long way away from us, except Myanmar. We have a lot of refugees, around 65,000 Rohingya have shot out of Myanmar in the last 3 months. They've mostly gone into Bangladesh, and they get there and they're like those people up on the border of Thailand that I was working with, the ethnic minority groups. No opportunity to work or send their kids to school or healthcare. And where do they go? They don't come to rich countries. This is a total furphy. That's the point of this slide. They go to poor countries. More than 90% of the refugees in the world are living in countries like Turkey and Pakistan and Lebanon and Iran, countries across the border from where they fled. Because everyone wants to go home. Everyone wants to go home. There's a tiny minority of people that are coming to places like Australia. And I think that's if we're going to really successfully manage this, I'm jumping to the end of my speech, but if we're going to really successfully manage this is where we need to focus our energy. I was on the border of Lebanon, watching these Syrian people come across, and at the stage of thousands of people coming across a day, children, carrying all they had left in the world, little plastic bags of their toys and clothes. I mean, heartbreaking stuff. And they would get there, and the UNHCR or the aid agency would give them a tent and a food ration. And that was pretty much it. Sometimes you might get, if there was a bit of aid money around that month, you might get some plastic buckets to make some water in, some clean water, or to cook some food, maybe a pot. People come with nothing because they're being, killed in their home country, and often they've got horrendous tales of, agony behind them. And they get across the border and they've got very little. And why you saw the massive influx of people going into, men particularly, single men going into Europe, was because when they get there, they can't send their kids to school. They can't legally work. They can't get access to healthcare. So this is where we need to be directing our aid money. It may surprise you, but to keep one person on Manus and Nauru for a year, do you know how much that costs? This is the Australian National Audit Office figure, $573,000. $573,111. One person for 1 year. As Munjed El Medeiros, who's an incredible surgeon who got out of Syria when Saddam came down and he wanted him to cut the ears off these people who'd slighted Saddam. Munjed shot out the window and then ended up making his way to Australia on a boat. He was locked up in detention centre. He caused a riot. He went to jail in Perth. He said being in jail was like heaven compared to being in a detention centre. But as he said at a conference recently about this $573,111 figure, we could be sending these people to Harvard and paying for them the whole way. I mean, they could even afford a house in Sydney. That's how ridiculous this whole situation is. And the other kind of cruel thing about this, maybe not Sydney, but the other cruel thing about this as well is that these countries, when you're living on the border of a country that's at war, at conflict, or where people are fleeing from, is your economy gets smashed. So Lebanon at the moment, 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. So can you imagine 6 million people turning up in Australia? How Australia might react to that. But the borders are still open. Lebanon still has its borders open. It's incredible. And before the crisis happened, around 50% of its total economy was coming from Syria. That's gone. So it's lost half its economy, and it's got to find, the infrastructure, the schooling, the resources to be able to look after these 25% increase in its population. It's phenomenal. With the project we set up with UNICEF, working with the Lebanese education department, which is quite different to some of the education departments you might be used to. But their level of generosity was amazing. The teachers there agreed to work from 7 in the morning until 12, where they'd teach the Lebanese kids. And then in the afternoon, they would work from 12:30 until 5:30, where they would teach the Syrian kids. That's the sort of sacrifice that these communities are making to look after the Syrians. I mean, it really does put us to shame. But refugees, they're not coming to Australia. Most of them aren't coming to Australia. And the ones that are resettled, last year 107,000 refugees were permanently resettled in the whole world. So 21 million, that's how many refugees there are, recognised ones. That's not counting all the people that are displaced or asylum seekers. So basically the population of Australia. But we've resettled, the population of Wagga in the whole world. It's tiny. The number of people resettled is tiny. They're never going to be resettled. I mean, if that is a queue, that queue's more than 200 years long. So, in a nutshell, 65 million people displaced, 21 million of them refugees, 10 million of them are stateless, we won't even go into that, and 107,000 will get resettled. And then, of course, we have Manus and Nauru, where we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars locking these people up. Australia's enacted a law called the Border Force Act, which says that anyone who sees things like child abuse, things like, physical abuse, if they come back and report that to Australia, that person can be locked up for 2 years. That is a law in Australia now. That the professionals there, the teachers, the sociologists, the guards, the psychologists, the childcare workers, if they see any kind of sexual abuse or physical abuse and come back and report it to Australia, they face 2 years in jail. It's absolutely astounding. But at the moment, we've got a royal commission going on into institutional child sexual abuse, and our government is letting this happen. We've passed a law to cover it up in another country, in a country that it's mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling. So Manus Island, I've had the opportunity to go to Manus a couple of times. Manus was the biggest naval base in the world in World War II. Had lots and lots of ships, and that's where the detention centre is on Manus. So although officially now the detention centre is closed according to Papua New Guinea, or it's open, so it's an open centre but officially doesn't exist depending on which minister is speaking on which day, the people in there can't get in or out because it's on a naval base, which is a highly securitised environment. The people in there, I'm in touch with people in there very regularly. They do have access to mobile phones and certainly to the internet sometimes. You can get in touch with them through Facebook or WhatsApp, and my number is out there in the public domain, so I get lots of calls in the middle of the night from people who are threatening suicide. Minister Dutton says that we're encouraging those people to commit suicide or self-harm to get off. I can tell you that's not the truth. We've had counselling through our organisation and with many of our member organisations in how to deal with these situations, in how to talk people down. And it's getting to the stage now where our staff once a week are having to talk someone down from committing suicide. Because, the food is really bad, and being told when you can eat and what you can eat is annoying, and the toilets aren't very clean. And, it's annoying when you can't go and play soccer when you want to. But ultimately what we've done is we've extinguished any hope for these people. That has been the thing that is driving them insane, literally insane. And it's the same on Manus and Nauru. So on Nauru, we talk about the fact there's no kids left in detention in Australia. There's actually 2, the Abdulatif kids. They're out at Villawood tonight, still in detention. But on Nauru, there's 150 kids, and the centre there is open, so people can come and go freely. But only about 30 of those kids are going to school because many of them are too scared to be able to go to school. And again, it's the extinguishment of hope. A young guy I was in touch with, took the most extreme step of setting himself alight. Because, the UNHCR was there and he wanted to make a statement to the world. I mean, it barely made a ripple. It's incredible the inhumanity that we have shown to these people. A small number of people, a couple of thousand. They could be resettled in Australia tomorrow. A couple of planes could get them off and they could be here. John Howard did it. John Howard did it back in 2004. After the Human Rights Commission did their report, he waited 6 months. Everyone was off Nauru. Everyone was off Manus. They're living amongst us. I know some of those people. They're contributing to our society. It's an absolute disgrace. And of course, there's the 30,000 people here who came by boat, who were being processed. So many of them have waited 5 or 6 years to be processed. They've set up these kind of ad hoc and discriminatory laws, which basically saying to these people, we're going to delay this as long as we can. We're not going to give you work rights or study rights. We're going to slowly cut away any kind of social security benefits that you have to be able to stay alive until you go back, because we want you to go back. We know eventually your mum will get sick, or your child that you haven't seen. Eventually that will pull your heartstring back home, and that's starting to happen. We had a guy go back to Syria 2 weeks ago. He lives in Homs. That's the insanity of the policy we've got now. There's 30,000 people tonight in Australia who will go to sleep in that situation. They're in an interminable limbo. And, we also, while I'm breaking myths, this is Zatri camp. So I was one of the people, played a very small role in helping this get set up. But it's kind of the general conception of a refugee camp. But only about 15% of people live in refugee camps. Most of them are living in urban settings, like these guys, the Rohingya guys in Thailand. And they're living in the same situation. They're living without access to legal work. They do have to work, of course. So they work in the plantations, or they work labouring on construction sites. The police at their roadblocks see them as they're coming. They're coming home with any cash they've got, because often their employers will rip them off, and they won't have much money left by the time they get home. And then the person across the street will know that they've got some money, so they get ripped off everywhere they go. The kids can't go to school. There's no access to healthcare. It's the same thing. This is where most refugees are living, in these situations, and these are the people we're affecting when we're turning back the boats. So what we've done at the Refugee Council, our government has cut $11 billion out of aid funding over the last 3 years. And really, this is where our money should be being directed, at places like the Cisarua Refugee Learning Centre, which the Refugee Council has helped supporting in Cisarua in Indonesia. Because of that, Australia won't resettle anyone from Indonesia. There's 14,000 people trapped there at the moment. But this is a refugee-led initiative. They've set it up. They've hooked up with the Jesuits. There's people actually going to university through some of the Jesuits now. They've got a full curriculum in place. They've got trained up teachers. And these are the sorts of things we should be supporting. And the other side of it is they're pretty amazing people. This guy's Arash, and he's with the head of UNHCR, Philip Grandi. He won the Human Rights Medal last year. He's been in Australia for a year. He missed 5 years of education when he came out of Iran. He was living in Malaysia, managed somehow to survive, and then get in the queue to come to Australia. He got in, talked his way into university, even though he'd missed 5 years of school, and got 2 of his mates in as well. Last year, he topped the course. We took him last year back to Geneva to talk to the UNHCR about how they can improve the situation there. He's now working with us in Malaysia to develop programs for people like him, for young people like him, to bring them together. He doesn't have to do this stuff. He just wants to get on with his life. But he feels that he can, and he has a responsibility to. This is Shakufa. I work with Shakufa. She's what she calls herself a good refugee. Her dad was a bad refugee. He came on a boat. He spent 5 years in detention. But now last year she topped law at UNSW. She's working at the Refugee Council. This is Narari. He's a Syrian refugee. He came to Australia. He was working for Google in Syria. He came to Australia, spent 13 months, couldn't get a job, so he set up his own business. He's got a business called Refugee Talent, where he's linking up people of refugee background with employers who want to employ them. He's currently employed around 60 people. He's been up and running for about 12 months. It's a brilliant initiative. We're working with him to try and bring people now who have qualifications out of the conflict from which he fled into Australia with employers. There's lots of ways you can get involved. The Refugee Council, many of our members are working on these. There's horrible stories, and we're all responsible for it. Our taxes are paying for Nauru and Manus, but we can make a difference. We have to make a difference. When I started school, I remember the story of the Good Samaritan. That was the thing that really turned me on to this stuff. And I was sitting with a friend the other day at lunch. He was asking me about it. Why do you do this sort of work? And it comes down to that, the Good Samaritan, welcoming the stranger. They're the things that we're talking about here today: truth, justice, compassion. And they're the opportunities that we have to grasp. So thank you very much.